Okay, well, thank you for bearing with us through the tech difficulties. They happen to everyone. So I wanted to start off with this watercolor, which was created by my grandfather when he was a young teenager at Gila River. He was a student, and I love his watercolors. He never became like a professional artist or anything, but they're just family treasures. And today, a print of one of his watercolors is up in the exhibition that you have, the exhibit that you have on Japanese American incarceration at Gila River. So I always knew that Gila River was on American Indian land. I knew that growing up. It was kind of always worked into how my dad told the story of Japanese American incarceration and his family's history. But when I was just recently graduated from college, I started working for the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. And Heart Mountain is where my dad's mom's family was sent. So his dad's dad was at Gila River, and his dad's mom went to Wyoming. And they kind of took a circuitous route there. This is them in 1944. Her brother Keo is in his military intelligence service uniform. And what I learned while working for Heart Mountain was that the Apsalake, or Crow, had been forced from Heart Mountain about 50 years before Japanese Americans were forced to. And I heard that and I was just like, what? Why would you do that? And now I think I know a little bit more about that, but back then I was like, that's just like a really weird coincidence, because my dad's family was put on an American Indian reservation too. And Keo, who had just finished his training at Fort Snelling, which is on Dakota homeland in Minnesota, and it was actually the site of the Dakota concentration camp following the US-Dakota War of 1862. So these connections started appearing in my own family's history, and I started noticing them kind of popping up as I was learning more about the topic. And I didn't really know what to make of them until I started graduate school. And graduate school taught me that these are really not coincidences, which really I feel like everyone should know that at this point, but I'm ashamed to say I did not. That actually this is structurally embedded into how the US is built. It's part of its settler colonial foundation as a country. And so I started working on this project, and it became clear to me how interconnected the experiences at different sites are. And that if we understand the connections between these different sites, we start to understand the structure of settler colonialism and how it fundamentally shaped Japanese American incarceration. So we have Heart Mountain, which was on Bureau of Reclamation land. Basically, they used Japanese American incarcerated labor to turn this land into what would later be distributed as white settler property through homesteading lotteries after the war. And that didn't just happen at Heart Mountain. It also happened at Tule Lake, another Bureau of Reclamation site, which was on Modoc land, the site of the US Modoc War, and they did that again there. And it also happened at Minidoka, the third reclamation site. And all three of these, within a year of Japanese Americans being forced to leave these sites, were then immediately turned into sites or homesteading lotteries for predominantly white veterans. And what that started to show me was that Japanese Americans were somehow sort of a stopping point between indigenous dispossession to the conversion of indigenous land into public land to Japanese American incarcerated labor, turning that into private property for white settlers. And that you see this longue durée of settler colonialism through the incarceration experience. At Gila River, as we all know, it was placed on Akimel Atham and Pipash land without the consent of the council. And likewise at Poston, placed on Mojave and Chemehuevi land, again, without permission from the council. And we also have Loop. Loop is a little bit of a weird case because it was a boarding school that was predominantly for Navajo children who, and it was on the reservation. And it had all of the abuses that we associate with those sorts of institutions, but it also was on their homelands, and so it had the comfort of those homelands, and also their parents were able to visit them periodically throughout the year. So whereas if you were sent off to Carlisle or somewhere else further away, it would be really hard for your family to visit you. Loop did have that important kind of space for the local Navajo around that area. So when they shut it down, within 9 months, they've turned it into an isolation center for troublemakers. And the reason that's important is because the Navajo had given the War Department permission to put enemy aliens on their land, on the site in the former boarding school, or to use it for the war, for national security, for the war effort. And the isolation center really does neither of those things. From two pre-war reports, we know that the Roosevelt administration knew that Japanese Americans posed no threat to national security, that mass confinement was not necessary. So they definitely knew that national security wasn't an issue here. And also, the people who were imprisoned at the isolation center were by and large American citizens, because the people who were Japanese immigrant leaders had already been arrested and had already been sent to DOJ, Army, Immigration and Naturalization Service camps. And so the people that the WRA had to confine and separate out were predominantly American citizens who were considered troublemakers. So they were not really imprisoning enemy aliens. And so you see that the War Relocation Authority, the War Department, the BIA kind of really running fast and loose with this interpretation of the invitation that they were given for Loop as well. And I think it's important that when we see all three of these together, we see they persistently disregarded Native sovereignty, that even though they acted like this was going to be a temporary infringement on that sovereignty, it still fundamentally served to destabilize the council's confidence and ability to assert their own vision for what that caretaking of their land should look like at all three sites. And I also think it's interesting to put what happened in Arizona in conversation with what was happening in Alaska at that point in time. Because John Collier took a very specific and special interest in Poston in particular. He had actually wanted Japanese Americans to be under the jurisdiction of Indian Affairs. And he had told Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior at the time, that he would like that. And Ickes said, no, we're not going to do that. So instead, he got Milton Eisenhower, the first director of the War Relocation Authority, the government organization that was established to manage Japanese American incarceration. He got them to agree to let him manage Poston directly. And so he put all of this BIA staff time into managing Poston. And while that didn't work out in the same way at Gila River, largely because the management style had kind of shifted over between the time the Poston Agreement was signed and the time the Gila River Agreement was signed. There was a change in leadership. So the first director quit and he basically couldn't stomach the work. And the next director totally shifted strategies, and he didn't want to fulfill any of the promises that had been made by his predecessor. So what you see is a lot of broken promises here. They didn't build the roads that they had promised to build. And I believe there was an Indian Claims Commission case that successfully argued that as well. But when you put this in conversation with Alaska, in Alaska, at that same point in time, they were removing Unanka from the Aleutian Islands into abandoned canneries and other abandoned facilities in the southeastern Alaska. And this was a very radical shift in geography for the Unangach. They knew nothing about the region that they were in. It really threw them for a loop. But they also didn't have any of the infrastructure built up that Japanese Americans received. And I don't want to act like that infrastructure was all that great for Japanese Americans. It wasn't. But one thing that they did do at Poston and at all of the camps was they brought out sewage experts. And you might not think that would be all that important, but if you put a lot of people in a concentrated area together, there is going to be a lot of sewage, and that opens up a lot of possibilities for contamination. So one of the things that happens at, I think actually at Gila River and at some of the other camps, is there are pipes that burst and sewage kind of just starts to like get into the lanes. And so there's like sewage alley and stuff like that. They kind of gave the streets kind of humorous names. So it's not like it was working all that well at Poston or Gila River, but they did at least put in that effort, right? And they did not do anything of the sort for the Unangach. Instead, they basically left them to their own devices. They were put into tents. They had to build more permanent housing for themselves. And it resulted in conditions. There was very little potable water. The water was almost immediately contaminated because of the strain on the sewage system that was inadequate and had already been shut down. And so you see a lot of disease popping up, and the death rate is really high. 1 in 10 actually died in these facilities. And when you take Collier's interest in Japanese American incarceration at Poston and put it alongside his complete ambivalence, disregard for Unangach in Alaska, the Unangach were under his jurisdiction already, or they were to a degree. So the Alaska Natives had only come under the jurisdiction of the BIA in 1932, so about a decade earlier. And the Unangach were actually exempted from that kind of reorganization of administration kind of stuff. Their services on, or their labor on the fur seal industry was so vital that the US basically agreed to keep them under the jurisdiction of fisheries and wildlife. And because of that, they end up, there are like 5 different agencies that are all involved in their removal. There's the Office of Indian Affairs, there's the Department of the Interior, there's the Army, the Navy, the Territory of Alaska, and Fisheries and Wildlife, so 6. And all 6 of those agencies play hot potato with their lives for the next 3 years. They send off, meanwhile, they of course send the men back into the Aleutians to participate in the fur seal trade, hunting for them, and then they keep their families removed and they won't let their families return to the Aleutian Islands. And so when you see that side-by-side interest and comparative disinterest in Unangach lives, I think you really start to see how the stakes of Japanese American incarceration go beyond a single project or single racial project. It's also worth noting that some Indigenous people were themselves incarcerated through this project as well. More than 60 Alaska Native incarcerees, either of mixed ancestry or because they were married or had a guardian who was incarcerated, were removed. Many of those families had other family members who were left at home. And as you can see here, a Tsimshian infant died at Puyallup. He was the youngest son of Minnie and Harvey Shirai. Harvey Shirai was mixed Japanese American and Tsimshian, and his wife Minnie was Tsimshian. And they had 4 young children under the age of 5. And none of them, except for Harvey, were subject to the removal orders. And Minnie was a tuberculosis patient. And so what happens is when they're trying to make arrangements for Minnie's care and the children's care when Harvey is preparing to leave, the Bureau of Indian Affairs reaches out to the territorial government of Alaska, and they start to panic because they realize that this woman and her 4 young children are going to be on welfare. And so they actually encourage the Alaska Defense Command to allow Minnie and her children to accompany Harvey to Puyallup instead of trying to find ways to keep them in place, which probably would have been better for her health in the long run. Minnie is soon afterwards transferred to a sanatorium with one of the children, and Harvey is sent off to Minidoka with the 60 other Alaska Native incarcerees. 2 more Tlingit babies died at Minidoka, but to return back to Manzanar, the other 3 Shirai children are separated from their parents and placed in the Manzanar Children's Home. And Minnie was in a sanatorium, so it makes sense that they were separated from her. It's not clear to me how the kids wound up at Manzanar when Harvey Shirai went to Minidoka. That hasn't been clarified in the archival record and really does point to the limitations of the archival record. So these stories are also part of the structural impact of Japanese American incarceration on Indigenous people. It is also worth mentioning that Manzanar is located in the Owens Valley and on the site of the Owens Valley War, which resulted in Mono being sent to Fort Tejon on land owned by the city of, or Manzanar is on land owned by the city of Los Angeles. So again, you see that kind of taking up of these sites over and over again in Japanese American incarceration. I have only located 2 mixed American Indian families so far, and it took me 7 years to find any trace of the names of the first family in the archives, and I really only stumbled across it, which I think really does point to how the archives can participate in really burying this history. A mixed Wasco Indian family from Warm Springs Confederated Indian tribes was sent here, and they remained separated for the duration of the war. So initially they were confined together. Most of the family was allowed to return to the reservation, but the father, George Danzuka, was not permitted to leave, and so he remained separated from his kids throughout the rest of the war, and he only lived for about a year after he returned, unfortunately. And a family of Yaktitu Titu, Northern Chumash, and Tongva descent was imprisoned and separated. First, they were sent to Santa Anita Assembly Center together. The rest of the family was released into the Western Defense Command, but their father, Wasuke, was sent on to Heart Mountain, where he unfortunately passed away, and the family never saw him again. So these are some of the other stories of how Japanese American incarceration impacted Indigenous people. Another important kind of connection is that the naming processes for, especially coming up with nicknames for the camps. So Amachi was the name for the post office that was chosen by Prowers County officials. And Prowers was a white settler who had been in the region early and became the namesake of the county, and they selected his wife, who was Cheyenne, to be the namesake for the camp post office. What gets really written out of that story, as another historian, Bernadette Perez, has shown, is that Amachi herself and her children had to be confined in their home to prevent them from warning their relatives of the Sand Creek Massacre. And so to give the name of someone who has herself experienced imprisonment to a concentration camp is a little bit strange, to say the least. And yet the name has become increasingly kind of formalized. In fact, in 2022, when the site became a national monument, it became Amachi National Monument, taking precedence over Grenada, which had been the historical name of the camp. And this, Amachi is the main place where it's the place where this is most obvious, but this did actually also happen at other places. So Gila River, the BIA, I think, essentially had the same opportunity as the Prowers County officials, and they chose the name Rivers for the post office after Jim Rivers. And Minidoka is a really weird kind of story that took a while to track down, but basically white land and irrigation speculators had contacted one of their friends on the East Coast who was like interested in Indian stuff, and he had a dictionary, an English Dakota dictionary, and this is not Dakota land by that point. It's like maybe on the very western edge of like Lakota land, but he basically pulls together a bunch of words from this dictionary and invents the name Minidoka. And I had the privilege of actually taking classes in Dakota at the University of Minnesota. And so I asked my teacher, have you ever heard that name before? And he was like, no. So that kind of instinct to like appropriate indigenous names or indigenous sounding names is something that is really deeply embedded in US settler colonial identity. It's one of the ways that that settlers kind of try to shape an identity for themselves outside of that it distinguishes them from Europe. And it's also worth noting that even as they try to capitalize off of that, they have simultaneously punished and criminalized indigenous assertions of their own cultures and their own languages, right? So these are just some of the connections that I'm thinking about in my project. And I think at this point that Japanese American incarceration was structurally, fundamentally a settler colonial project as well. And that it hasn't really been analyzed as such needs to be fixed. Most Americans aren't learning enough about either of these histories, but they're definitely not learning enough about the two of them together and how they're intertwined. So yeah, another connection. Dylan Meyer, he was the director of the WRA, and you might recognize his name because he went on to become Commissioner of Indian Affairs, where he was really known for his terrible termination policies. He had like a 3-year tenure, and he did a lot of harm during that time. And his termination policies, his predecessor, John Collier, thought that his termination policies were based on the apparent success of his resettlement policies for Japanese Americans. So he really thought that he could just take what had seemed to work for one group, and I would debate whether it actually worked for that group, and then trying to impose it on people who are deeply connected to their communities and to their homelands, and instead sending them off to urban areas to work as menial labor. It was like a very direct echo. So the connections are all over the place here. So in 2018, I had the privilege of coming and doing an internship at the Hugam Heritage Center. And it was a really moving experience for me to see how the center and how other staff at Gila River have really been caretakers of Japanese American incarceration memory. So these are photos that I took from, like, I think I visited about a year ago. And that's one of my grandfather's other watercolors. This is the bust of Sayoko Kawamura. And some of you might know this story. I think the story is just really profoundly touching. She was a young girl who was first imprisoned at Jerome, which is where my grandmother was initially sent before she was sent to Heart Mountain. Jerome was closed and it was turned into a POW camp in 1944. And when my grandmother was sent off to Heart Mountain, she went off to Gila River. And she and her family only spent about 4 months at Gila River. And then they were sent off to Seabrook Farms, which is actually my grandfather's family also went from Gila River to Seabrook Farms. A lot of Japanese Americans did that. So even though she was a little bit younger than my grandfather, she would have been a little bit older than my great uncle who would have been at Jerome in school with her. Part of me like always asked myself, did she know them? Did they ever intersect, or did they walk by one another on the street? But what I found really touching about this bust in particular was that it was thrown away by Japanese American incarcerees, probably because they had nowhere to take it. A lot of Japanese Americans, when they left the camps, they had to move into hostels that were quickly set up in Buddhist churches and other places. They didn't have a place to return to, and a lot of people wouldn't lease to them, and most of them couldn't own land. So because of this, if you didn't have a final address, it wouldn't really make sense to send off something that that was pretty heavy and you couldn't really hope to keep. And we all know that the WRA comes in, and its idea of bringing the site back to its original condition is to just raise everything and to take away anything that could be possibly of use, right? They take away the copper wiring, and the reservation doesn't get electricity until 3 decades later. But in the midst of all that, someone went through and salvaged this bust and one other, and he saw others as well. And he took care of this bust for multiple decades and even passed it along to another community member who then donated it to the Huhugam Heritage Center, where it was being kept. When I was interning, it was being kept in their collections alongside baskets, and the collections or curator and collection staff showed me how they in addition to following, archives, best practices, it was all very state of the art. They also had sage in the collection space, and that was an important caretaking practice for their collections. Made me feel a lot, it was a really emotional kind of thing for me to witness how this history was being cared for by Gila River Indian community members. And then I got to visit the actual site with Paul Shorthair, and he took me to the exact spot where my family's barrack was. And if you try to visit Heart Mountain, you can't do that. Like, the entire site, because it was turned into farmland, is essentially very green pastures, right? So I have no idea where my grandmother's barrack was at Heart Mountain, and the same at Jerome, because Jerome was also converted into private property after the war. But to be given that kind of special tour of the site and to be taken specifically to the place where that 20 by 20 foot room where my grandfather and his brother and their parents lived for 3 years was a really meaningful for me. And I think that one thing that kind of gets left out of this story is how a community that was basically pushed to take on Japanese Americans without their consent, and that resisted that for 6 months before being essentially pushed into a position where they had to sign the lease agreement. That resistance and that caretaking, I think, are important parts of the story of Japanese American incarceration. And I really hope that you agree with me on that, and I would love to keep chatting with you all about what you have heard about this history in your communities, and what you would like to see come out of any future research that I do. So thank you so much. Om